Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga stood aboard the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi on the morning of June 4, 1942, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline of the bombing mission he'd just completed over Midway. The time read 22 minutes past 10 in the morning. Below him, through the bridge observation windows, a scene of organized pandemonium unfolded as deck crews hustled Type 99 dive bombers out of the way, while Type 97 torpedo aircraft had their weapons swapped from aerial torpedoes to 800-kilogram explosive devices meant for land targets. Fuel lines crisscrossed the wooden deck planking like industrial serpents. In the breast pocket of his flight suit sat an unfinished letter addressed to his wife, its final sentence reading that the Americans were nowhere in sight and victory was assured. What Lieutenant Tomonaga couldn't possibly have known in that moment was that American warplanes were already converging on his precise location. He had no way of understanding that the next 11 minutes would dictate not merely the outcome of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, but would fundamentally alter the entire course of the war being fought across the Pacific Ocean. He couldn't comprehend that every assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy held regarding carrier-based warfare, American military capabilities, and their own perceived invincibility was about to be obliterated in roughly the amount of time required to brew and consume a pot of green tea. Down on the flight deck itself, a petty officer, first class, named Kaname Harada, supervised teams of aircraft mechanics working with frantic urgency to complete the weapons changeover that Admiral Nagumo had commanded just moments earlier. The Japanese naval aviators had drilled these procedures repeatedly, practicing the conversion from land attack ordnance to ship attack munitions, but never under such intense time constraints, never while receiving contradictory intelligence reports from reconnaissance aircraft, never with the gnawing sensation that despite all visible evidence pointing toward Japanese superiority, something fundamental had gone terribly wrong. At precisely 20 minutes after 10 o'clock, the Japanese carrier strike force had been the undisputed masters of the Pacific theater, preparing their aircraft to eliminate what they believed was a solitary American flat top in the vicinity. By 31 minutes past 10, 3 of their 4 carriers would be transformed into dying steel coffins, turned into floating funeral pyres by American dive bomber squadrons that seemed to materialize from absolutely empty sky. Those 11 minutes would expose fundamental truths about modern naval combat that neither navy completely understood until events played out in real time above the endless blue expanse of the Pacific. The numerical superiority of the Japanese naval forces seemed mathematically unquestionable on that June morning in 1942. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded what was called the Kido Butai, representing the most powerful concentration of carrier-based striking power ever assembled by any nation. His force included 4 full-sized fleet carriers named Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, operating 248 aircraft crewed by the most battle-experienced naval aviators anywhere in the world. These were veterans who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, the Indian Ocean raids, the strikes on Darwin, and operations near Ceylon. These men had sent more Allied warships to the bottom in 6 months than the Imperial Navy had destroyed throughout all its previous conflicts combined. Opposing this formidable fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned 3 American carriers designated Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, with the latter having sustained damage that should have required 3 full months of shipyard repairs, but was made minimally seaworthy through 72 continuous hours of emergency work performed by 1,400 labourers at Pearl Harbor. The Americans fielded 233 aircraft, most piloted by aviators who had never experienced actual combat, many possessing fewer than 300 total flight hours. The torpedo bomber squadrons flew the TBD Devastator, an aircraft so hopelessly obsolete that its own pilots had nicknamed it the TBD, which they said stood for Torpedoed Dead. Captain Taijiro Aoki, serving aboard the Akagi, had expressed complete confidence in his war diary entry, writing that the American Navy represented a broken and defeated force, and that after the current day's operations concluded, the Americans would possess no operational carriers remaining in the Pacific theater, effectively ending the war. This wasn't mere bragging or empty confidence. The Japanese had emerged victorious from every carrier engagement fought thus far in the conflict. During the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month prior, representing the first carrier versus carrier naval battle in human history, they had managed to sink the USS Lexington, America's second-largest flat-top, while losing only the light carrier Shoho themselves. They had raided the Australian port of Darwin without facing any opposition, struck at Ceylon without encountering resistance, and had operated with complete freedom of movement from Hawaiian waters all the way to the Indian Ocean. What the Japanese commanders didn't know that morning would fill entire libraries. They remained unaware that American cryptographic analysts working at a facility called Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had successfully broken their JN-25 naval communications code. They had no idea that Admiral Nimitz had literally read their operational orders, knew with certainty that their target was Midway Island, understood the complete composition of their attacking force, and had positioned his carrier task forces accordingly to execute a devastating ambush. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius responsible for planning the Pearl Harbor strike, lay seriously ill with pneumonia in his cabin below the Akagi's bridge. His absence from the command center during critical decision-making would prove absolutely catastrophic. He alone among the Japanese senior commanders had consistently advocated for maintaining a permanent reserve of aircraft already armed for anti-shipping operations at all times. His temporary replacement, Commander Tamotsu Oishi, lacked both Genda's intuitive grasp of carrier warfare and his paranoid suspicion regarding American carrier locations. The Japanese also remained ignorant of the fact that Yorktown was operational and combat-ready. Their naval intelligence services had confirmed she'd sustained heavy damage at Coral Sea, which was accurate information. They had estimated a minimum of 3 months would be required for adequate repairs, which would have been true for any Japanese naval shipyard. They simply couldn't conceive that American dockyard workers at Pearl Harbor had compressed 3 months of repair work into 3 days of around-the-clock labor, that welding crews had continued working while the ship was already underway heading toward Midway, that her aircraft elevators had been repaired while she was actively sailing toward the battle zone. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo had dispatched 7 scout planes to search for any American naval forces. This represented a compromise from standard operational doctrine. Proper procedure called for launching dozens of reconnaissance aircraft, but Nagumo wanted to preserve his aircraft strength for the upcoming strike against Midway Island itself. Each scout would fly a single search line extending 300 nautical miles outbound and then return, leaving vast sections of ocean completely unsearched. The most critically important search pattern, designated as Line Number 4 and launched from the cruiser tone, departed 30 minutes behind schedule due to mechanical problems with the ship's catapult system. This single equipment malfunction would position Tone's reconnaissance aircraft over the American fleet at the absolute worst possible moment for the Japanese, precisely when their carrier decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled simultaneously. Petty Officer First Class Amari, serving as a scout plane observer from the battleship Haruna, later provided testimony stating they flew their assigned search pattern, seeing nothing except empty ocean in all directions. They had been trained to recognize what they anticipated encountering, which meant merchant vessels and perhaps a cruiser or two. Nobody was actively looking for American aircraft carriers because nobody genuinely believed American carriers were anywhere in the operational area. At 4:30 in the morning, while darkness still covered the ocean, 108 Japanese aircraft had launched for the strike mission against Midway Island. The strike package included 36 Zero fighters providing escort, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Kate torpedo bombers, carrying bombs rather than torpedoes. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the entire strike formation, his aircraft equipped with a radio that would soon transmit the message, triggering a chain reaction of fatal command decisions. The Midway strike force encountered unexpectedly fierce resistance over the target. American fighter aircraft, consisting of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats, were positioned and waiting at high altitude, having been alerted by radar detection systems. The anti-aircraft fire proved both intense in volume and accurate in placement. The Japanese lost 11 aircraft outright and had 14 more heavily damaged. More significantly for subsequent events, Lieutenant Tomonaga transmitted a radio message at 7 o'clock in the morning, stating there was a clear need for a second attack wave against Midway. This communication arrived aboard Nagumo's flagship just as the admiral was facing the most crucial decision of his entire military career. He had retained 93 aircraft in reserve aboard his carriers, consisting of torpedo planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs specifically intended for anti-ship attack. American B-17 heavy bombers from Midway were bombing his fleet from high altitude, ineffectively in terms of scoring hits but forcing the carriers to execute evasive maneuvers. Torpedo bombers launched from Midway had just completed their attack runs, also failing to score any hits, but clearly demonstrating that Midway retained offensive strike capability. Commander Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu argued strenuously for maintaining the anti-ship armament configuration. He told the admiral they should keep the reserve strike force armed for ship attack regardless, pointing out that hearing nothing from their reconnaissance aircraft didn't definitively mean no American ships were present in the area. But Admiral Nagumo, feeling pressure from the ongoing attacks and influenced heavily by Tomonaga's message requesting additional strikes on Midway, made his fateful decision at 15 minutes past 7 in the morning. He ordered all torpedoes removed and replaced with bombs configured for land attack missions. What followed represented controlled chaos that would ultimately prove fatal to the Japanese carriers. Each Type 97 Kate torpedo bomber carried either one Type 91 torpedo or one 800-kilogram land attack bomb. Switching between these two weapon types required rolling the aircraft down to the hangar deck using the ship's elevators, removing the torpedo using specialized handling carriages, mounting the bomb using completely different attachment hardware, adjusting the release mechanism to account for different ballistic characteristics, returning the aircraft to the flight deck via elevator, and refueling for a different mission profile requiring different fuel loads. Aviation Ordnance Man, Second Class. Takeshi Maeda, serving on the Kaga, later provided a description of the scene unfolding below decks. He said they worked like possessed demons, with torpedoes being stacked directly on the hangar deck because returning them to the armoured magazines deep in the ship took far too much precious time. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere across the deck. They were actively refueling aircraft while simultaneously changing weapons, something strictly forbidden by safety regulations, but absolutely necessary to save critical minutes. The hangar deck had essentially become a massive bomb with a lit fuse already burning. But nobody was thinking about the danger because they had executed this drill hundreds of times during training exercises. On the Akagi, the situation grew even more complex and time-consuming. That ship carried Type 99 dive bombers that could be loaded with either 250-kilogram general-purpose bombs or 242-kilogram semi-armor-piercing bombs. The latter were specifically designed for attacking ships, while the former were intended for land targets. Ordnance crews had to not only physically change the bombs, but actually change bomb types entirely, with each type requiring different fusing mechanisms and different mounting bracket configurations. At 28 minutes past 7 in the morning, while the frantic rearming operations continued below decks on all four carriers, the Tone's delayed scout plane finally reached its designated turning point. The pilot, Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Amari, was preparing to turn back toward the fleet when he spotted white wakes cutting across the horizon. His radioed report was frustratingly vague, stating he sighted what appeared to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 nautical miles from Midway, proceeding on course 150 degrees at speed exceeding 20 knots. Admiral Nagumo received this transmission at 40 minutes past 7. 10 ships could mean virtually anything in terms of threat level. They could be destroyers, transport vessels, or cruisers. Nothing that required the urgent and immediate attention of his carrier striking force. He continued the rearming operations for land attack while simultaneously ordering the scout aircraft to determine ship types and maintain contact with the enemy formation. At 55 minutes past 7, Nagumo received another message that would later haunt his memory. The scout reported that enemy ships consisted of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief flooded through the bridge officers. Cruisers and destroyers meant no carriers present. The rearming could proceed without interruption. Some officers actually celebrated, pointing out that catching an American surface force operating without air cover would provide excellent hunting opportunities. But at 9 minutes past 8 o'clock, yet another message arrived from the scout, this one correcting all previous reports. The message stated the enemy force was accompanied by what appeared to be one carrier bringing up the rear of the formation. The bridge of the Akagi erupted in what could only be described as controlled panic. A single carrier, even just one, fundamentally changed every calculation. Within seconds, Nagumo issued completely new orders. He commanded them to suspend the rearming operations immediately, leave torpedoes on any aircraft that still retained them, and prepare to launch a ship attack strike at the earliest possible moment. But the situation on the hangar decks and flight decks had already passed beyond any point of easy recovery. Half the aircraft had bombs physically attached, but not yet fused for combat use. Other aircraft had torpedoes only partially mounted. Some planes sat on the flight deck configured with bombs, while others remained in the hangars with torpedoes. To launch any kind of coordinated strike, all aircraft needed to be armed identically using the same weapon type. The ordnance crews required at least 45 minutes to either complete the bomb conversion entirely or return all aircraft to torpedo configuration. The actual situation proved even worse than anyone on the bridge fully realized. The returning Midway strike force was now approaching the carriers, critically low on fuel, many aircraft carrying battle damage, all of them needing to land immediately or ditch in the ocean. Japanese naval doctrine was absolutely inflexible on this point. You recovered your own aircraft first before launching any new strikes. To do otherwise would mean losing dozens of aircraft and, far more critically, losing the veteran pilots flying those aircraft. At 30 minutes past 8 in the morning, Admiral Nagumo made what history would record as his second fatal decision of the day. He ordered them to recover the Midway strike force first, and then they would deal with the American carrier afterward. From 37 minutes past 8 until 17 minutes past 9, all 4 Japanese carriers focused their complete attention on recovering the Midway strike force. This operation, even under ideal peacetime circumstances, represented a complex choreography. They had to clear the flight deck completely of parked aircraft, turn the entire ship into the wind, recover incoming aircraft in strict sequence with damaged aircraft landing first, then fighters with lowest fuel states, then bombers. They had to strike recovered aircraft below to the hangar deck immediately to clear deck space for additional landings, refuel and rearm all recovered aircraft, and spot fresh aircraft on deck for the next launch. What none of the Japanese commanders knew was that time had already expired for them. At 2 minutes past 7 that morning, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise had made the single most important decision of his entire career. He ordered his carriers to launch everything immediately, at absolute maximum range, without waiting to properly coordinate a textbook strike package. His Air Operations Officer, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had protested the order, pointing out that the Admiral was launching aircraft at extreme range, where many planes wouldn't have sufficient fuel to make it back to the carriers. Spruance's reply would prove prophetic when he said they might lose planes to fuel exhaustion, but if they could catch the Japanese carriers while they were recovering their Midway strike force, they would catch them at their single most vulnerable moment. The American carrier launch operations between 2 minutes past 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning represented barely controlled chaos that would have absolutely appalled any Japanese naval aviation instructor observing the proceedings. Instead of a beautifully coordinated strike package with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers all arriving simultaneously over the target, each American squadron launched the instant it was ready and proceeded independently toward the last known Japanese position. From Enterprise came 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers organized in 2 separate squadrons, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Hornet came 35 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Yorktown, launching 2 hours later than the other carriers, came 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 6 F-4F Wildcat fighters. The launch operations represented an absolute disaster when measured against Japanese operational standards. Different squadrons became separated from each other almost immediately. Fighter aircraft flew at completely different altitudes from the bombers they were supposed to protect. Radio discipline collapsed entirely with pilots chattering on frequencies. Navigation errors sent entire squadrons flying in wrong directions. The Hornet's fighter squadrons and dive bomber squadrons never found the Japanese fleet at all, eventually running out of fuel and either ditching in the ocean or returning to base, having accomplished nothing. Ensign George Gay, flying a torpedo bomber with Hornet's VT-8 squadron, later described the situation to historians. He said they launched knowing full well they probably wouldn't have sufficient fuel to make it back to the carriers. Their squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had told them absolutely straight that they were going alone without fighter escort. They would probably all be killed, but they were going to hit those Japanese carriers regardless. They flew off separately from their own fighters and dive bombers. It was suicide, but it was also what they had trained to do. At 18 minutes past 9, just as the final Japanese aircraft from the Midway strike settled onto carrier decks, radar equipment on the Soryu detected incoming aircraft flying low on the water. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's VT-8 squadron, consisting of 15 obsolete torpedo bombers flying without any fighter escort whatsoever, had found the Japanese fleet through Waldron's brilliant navigation skills and sheer determined willpower. The massacre that followed was utterly complete. All 15 TBD Devastator aircraft were shot down by Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. 29 of the 30 aircrew were killed. Only Ensign Gay survived, hiding under his seat cushion floating in the water, watching everything that came next. Not a single American torpedo struck any Japanese ship, but the sacrifice, which seemed completely futile at the time, had actually achieved something crucially important. The Japanese Zero fighters had all descended to sea level to attack the torpedo bombers. The carriers had been forced into violent evasive maneuvers, making it impossible to spot aircraft for launch operations. Most critically, the attention of every single Japanese lookout and observer was focused downward at the water surface, not upward toward the sky above. At 36 minutes past 9 in the morning, Enterprise's VT-6 squadron arrived over the Japanese fleet. 14 more torpedo bombers, also without fighter escort, pressed home their attacks. They too were massacred, losing 10 of 14 aircraft without scoring a single torpedo hit. At 10 o'clock precisely, Yorktown's VT-3 squadron arrived on scene. 12 more torpedo bombers accompanied by a handful of fighter escorts attacked desperately. They lost 10 of 12 aircraft, again failing to score any hits. By 20 minutes past 10 in the morning, the last of the American torpedo bomber squadrons had been either destroyed or driven off, fleeing for their lives. The Japanese carriers began recovering their Zero fighters, now critically low on ammunition and fuel from slaughtering the American torpedo planes. Victory seemed absolutely complete and total. Not one single American torpedo had struck home, and 35 of 41 American torpedo bombers had been destroyed. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo finally allowed himself to relax slightly. His operations officer reported that they could be ready to launch their strike against the American carrier in 30 minutes, with all aircraft properly armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The flight decks of all 4 Japanese carriers were packed tightly with aircraft. The Akagi had 40 aircraft spotted on deck, fully fueled and armed. The Kaga had 30 aircraft. The Soryu had 33. The Hiryu, steaming somewhat north of the other three carriers, had 38 aircraft ready. Fuel hoses remained connected to numerous aircraft. Ordnance crews were still making final adjustments to bomb and torpedo mounting hardware. Pilots sat in their cockpits with engines warming up, ready to launch. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise dive bomber squadrons had been flying in wide circles, searching desperately for the Japanese fleet that wasn't where intelligence had predicted it would be. Critically low on fuel, McCluskey had made an educated guess. He decided to follow a Japanese destroyer he spotted racing northeast at high speed. That single guess led him directly over the Japanese carriers at their single most vulnerable moment in the entire battle. At 22 minutes past 10, McCluskey's 33 dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives from 14,500 feet altitude. The Zero fighters were all at sea level, refueling and rearming. The anti-aircraft guns remained trained horizontally for defending against torpedo attacks. The flight decks were absolutely covered with aircraft, fuel lines and ordnance. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, selected the Akagi as his primary target. In his official after-action report, he wrote that the carrier was turning into the wind with her deck packed solid with aircraft. He could actually see crew members running on the deck, fuel hoses being frantically disconnected, aircraft engines trying to start. They had perhaps 60 seconds of warning, nowhere near enough time to react effectively. At 26 minutes past 10, Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the Akagi's flight deck near the midship elevator. The bomb exploded in the hangar deck among the torpedoes and bombs that had been removed from aircraft and stacked against every safety regulation directly in the hangar spaces. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's squadron dove on the massive cargo. 4 bombs struck the enormous carrier in less than 30 seconds of time. The first bomb hit forward, completely destroying the bridge structure and killing Captain Jisaku Okada, along with his entire command staff instantly. The subsequent bombs hit directly among the packed aircraft sitting on deck. The induced explosions were absolutely catastrophic in their violence. The 80,000 litres of aviation fuel, the torpedoes and the bombs aboard cargo began exploding in rapid sequence. Within just minutes, the ship had become an inferno extending from bow to stern. The heat generated was so intense that firefighting crews couldn't approach within 50 feet of the flames without their protective gear catching fire. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers arrived at almost exactly the same moment, targeting the Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit the carrier in a perfect line running down the length of the flight deck. The first bomb exploded in the forward hangar. The second struck amidships among densely packed aircraft. The third completely destroyed the rear elevator structure. The Soryu possessed a particular design vulnerability that now proved fatal. She carried extra aviation fuel in supplementary tanks positioned along the sides of the hangar deck to extend her aircraft operational range. These tanks ruptured immediately upon impact, creating a massive firestorm that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. At 31 minutes past 10, as suddenly as the attack had begun, it was over. McCluskey's dive bomber squadrons were heading back toward their carriers, many aircraft running on vapor fumes in their tanks. In just 11 minutes of combat, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from the most powerful warships afloat into burning hulks that would never fight again. On the Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo stood in complete shock as explosions continued rocking the ship beneath his feet. His operations officer, Commander Oishi, was shouting damage reports that seemed utterly impossible to comprehend. Flight deck completely destroyed, hangar deck engulfed in flames, all aircraft lost. Steering control completely lost. Communications systems destroyed. Captain Taijiro Aoki physically grabbed Admiral Nagumo, who appeared paralyzed and unable to process what had happened. He shouted at the admiral that they must transfer his flag to another ship immediately because the Akagi was lost and sinking. On the Kaga, the situation was even more desperate. With the captain and all senior officers killed instantly in the first bomb hit, Command had devolved to the damage control officer, who found himself trapped below decks and surrounded by fire. The Soryu was dying fastest of all three carriers. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto refused absolutely to abandon his bridge even as flames approached his position. His final order, heard and remembered by several survivors, was to save themselves while he would remain with Soryu until the end. He was last seen lashing himself to the ship's helm, absolutely determined to go down with his vessel. In the minutes immediately following 31 minutes past 10, the Japanese Navy faced a crisis beyond anything contemplated in their war planning or peacetime training. 3/4 of their carrier striking power had been eliminated in less time than required to conduct a single aircraft landing operation. On the Hiryu, the only surviving carrier, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi watched in absolute horror as massive smoke columns rose from his three sister ships burning on the horizon. The mathematics of the situation were utterly devastating. In 11 minutes, the Japanese had lost 3 full fleet carriers, approximately 110 aircraft that had been spotted on flight decks, 40 additional aircraft stored in hangars, 50 aircraft currently airborne with nowhere to land and which would eventually be lost, and over 2,000 highly skilled aircrew and maintenance personnel would ultimately die. The scenes aboard the burning carriers defied any adequate description. On the Akagi, induced explosions continued for hours. Each explosion sent sheets of steel plating flying like enormous scythes through compartments packed with trapped men. The hangar deck had become a literal crematorium where men were burned alive. On the Kaga, the ship's massive size, resulting from her origins as a converted battleship hull, meant more compartments and more trapped men unable to escape. The fires raging above made any rescue attempts completely impossible. The steel bulkheads became so superheated they glowed red in the darkness. Hundreds of men died trapped in sealed steel compartments. The Soryu's chief engineer, Commander Kondo, somehow survived to later describe the catastrophe in the engine rooms. The first bomb severed the main steam lines. Superheated steam at 400 degrees Celsius filled the compartments almost instantly. Men were literally steamed alive where they stood. Others suffocated as the fires consumed every molecule of oxygen in the sealed spaces. Admiral Yamaguchi on the Hiryu faced an impossible tactical situation with characteristic Japanese aggression. Despite having only one carrier remaining to face 3 American carriers, he immediately ordered a counterstrike launched. At 58 minutes past 10, just 27 minutes after the devastating American attack, Hiryu launched 18 Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The strike force found Yorktown at noon precisely. Despite facing fully prepared defences and radar-directed fighter interception, the veteran Japanese pilots pressed home their attack with absolute determination. 3 bombs struck Yorktown, starting serious fires and damaging her boiler systems. The American carrier slowed to a complete stop, dead in the water. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately ordered a second strike launched without waiting. At 31 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, 10 Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters launched from Hiryu's deck. This tiny force located Yorktown again at 42 minutes past 2. Despite facing absolutely intense anti-aircraft fire that destroyed half the attacking aircraft, they managed to put 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's port side. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning strike against Midway, personally led this final desperate attack. His aircraft had sustained damage over Midway that morning, puncturing his left-wing fuel tank. He knew with absolute certainty he didn't possess enough fuel to return to the carrier, but he launched anyway without hesitation. His torpedo was one of the 2 that struck Yorktown. His aircraft crashed into the sea immediately afterward, having completely exhausted its fuel supply. At 3 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, the inevitable finally occurred. 24 American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown located the Hiryu. 4 direct bomb hits transformed the last Japanese carrier into yet another floating inferno. Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Hiryu, mortally wounded by the attack, gave his final order to scuttle the ship and save whatever crew could be rescued. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard the dying ship. His final message to his surviving staff officers was that he would personally apologize to the Emperor for the defeat, while they would rebuild the navy for future battles. As the Japanese carriers burned throughout the afternoon and evening, surviving officers began comprehending the full magnitude of their intelligence failure. The evidence became overwhelming when examined in retrospect. American carriers positioned at precisely the correct location, Midway Island fully alerted and completely prepared for attack, submarines positioned along all Japanese approach routes, strike aircraft launched at maximum possible range at exactly the optimal time. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, serving as operations officer for the combined fleet, would later write in his memoirs that they realized the Americans had been reading their communications. Every message, every operational order, every tactical plan had been intercepted and decoded. They had been performing an elaborate military operation for an audience that already knew the complete script. The surprise they believed they possessed had actually belonged entirely to the Americans all along. Beyond the catastrophic intelligence failure, the battle had revealed fundamental truths about carrier warfare that the Japanese had failed to understand despite their extensive combat experience. Their entire operational doctrine, based on massed carrier operations, beautifully coordinated strikes, and holding reserve forces, had been theoretically correct. But they had utterly failed to execute that doctrine properly under the intense pressure of combat. The American dive bomber, specifically the SBD Dauntless, had proved superior to the highly vaunted Japanese Val dive bomber in the only metric that ultimately mattered, which was survivability while actually delivering ordnance onto targets. The American operational doctrine of deckload strikes rather than hangar storage meant they could launch aircraft faster when needed. The American damage control procedures, which Japanese officers had previously mocked as overcautious and inefficient, had already saved Yorktown once at Coral Sea and would save numerous other carriers throughout the remaining war years. As darkness fell across the Pacific on June 4th, thousands of Japanese sailors floated in the water or crowded aboard destroyers that had rescued them. The three carriers remained technically afloat but were burning abandoned hulks on the horizon. Many Japanese sailors actually refused rescue attempts, believing they had failed the Emperor and deserved death. Men would actively swim away from rescue lines being thrown to them, shouting that the Emperor should live 10,000 years, and then deliberately dive underwater, holding their breath until they drowned. What the Japanese commanders didn't know was that the Americans actually believed they were losing the battle even as they achieved their greatest victory. Admiral Spruance, receiving preliminary reports of his missing squadrons, calculated he had lost over half his total aircraft strength. Yorktown was crippled and listing badly. Japanese submarines were being reported throughout the operational area. Spruance's decision to continue the engagement despite this uncertainty would prove absolutely crucial. His scout aircraft found the burning Japanese carriers that evening, finally confirming the magnitude of the American victory. But even then, the Americans didn't fully comprehend what they had actually achieved. June 5th brought cruel confirmation of both American fears and Japanese disaster. The submarine designated a 168, specifically dispatched by Admiral Yamamoto to find and destroy damaged American carriers, located Yorktown under tow by other ships, barely moving. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes in a perfect spread. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown directly. 1 additional torpedo hit the destroyer Hammond alongside, providing assistance. Yorktown would finally sink on June 7th, becoming the last carrier lost at the Battle of Midway. But by that point, the ultimate outcome had already been decided beyond any doubt. The 4 Japanese carriers were completely gone, scuttled by their own destroyer escorts when it became absolutely clear they couldn't be saved or towed to safety. The human cost of those 11 minutes continued mounting for days afterward. The Akagi was scuttled by Japanese destroyers at 5 o'clock in the morning on June 5th, after burning continuously for 19 hours. The Kaga sank at 25 minutes past 7 in the evening on June 4th, taking 811 men down with her into the depths. The Soryu went under at 13 minutes past 7 on June 4th, carrying 711 men to their deaths. The Hiryu's death toll reached 218 men. But these weren't merely sailors and ordinary seamen. These were the irreplaceable experienced mechanics who could service complex aircraft engines under combat conditions, the skilled armourers who could mount torpedoes in minutes rather than hours, the trained fuel handlers who could conduct dangerous underway replenishment operations, the veteran pilots who had conquered half the Pacific Ocean in just 6 months of warfare. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard the massive battleship Yamato positioned 300 miles behind the carrier striking force, received the catastrophic reports in complete silence. His staff officer, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, later described the scene to historians. The admiral sat absolutely motionless for nearly an entire hour after learning of the fourth carrier's loss. Then he spoke quietly, saying the war was finished. They would continue fighting because honor demanded it, but the war was already over and lost. Admiral Yamamoto understood what others would require months to fully grasp. Japan had begun the war with 10 fleet and light carriers in total. In just 6 months of operations, they had lost 5 carriers. They could theoretically build new carriers, and they would attempt to do so, but they simply couldn't replace the trained crews operating those ships. A qualified carrier pilot required 2 full years of intensive training. A skilled aircraft mechanic needed 18 months of technical education. A flight deck crew needed 6 months of intensive drilling to operate with acceptable efficiency. The mathematics were absolutely inexorable and unavoidable. America would launch 17 new carriers by the time Japan managed to commission just 1 replacement. American pilot training programs were producing 10,000 new pilots monthly by 1943. Japan never exceeded 500 pilots per month and couldn't adequately replace combat losses. The survivors of Midway carried psychological scars that affected the entire Japanese Navy for the remainder of the war. The myth of absolute invincibility was completely shattered. The confidence that had driven operations from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon evaporated in 11 minutes of American dive bomber attacks. The Japanese Navy instituted numerous new procedures based on lessons learned at Midway. Combat air patrol forces always retained aircraft at altitude. Flight decks were kept clear unless immediately launching strikes. Ordnance was returned to armoured magazines immediately after use. Multiple overlapping search patterns were implemented. Radio silence was abandoned in favour of tactical communication when necessary. But these changes came far too late and addressed merely the symptoms rather than the fundamental cause of defeat. The underlying cause was that American intelligence capabilities, industrial production capacity, and technological innovation had already surpassed Japan's capabilities. For the Americans, those 11 minutes created an entirely different transformation, converting them from desperate defenders into confident aggressors. The Pacific Fleet, deeply traumatized by the Pearl Harbor attack, had discovered they could not merely fight the Japanese Navy, but could actually destroy it decisively. Admiral Nimitz, receiving final confirmation of the victory, told his staff that the Japanese were not supermen possessing mystical warrior powers. They could be beaten in combat. They had been beaten decisively. Now the Americans would take the strategic offensive. The tactical lessons learned were immediately incorporated into operational doctrine. Dive bombers were the supreme ship-killing weapons. Coordinated strikes were ideal, but not absolutely essential for success. First strike advantage was decisive in carrier warfare. Radar-directed fighter control was crucial for defense. Damage control procedures could save seemingly doomed ships. But the most important lesson was fundamentally psychological rather than tactical. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Hornet's VT-8 squadron who had floated in the water watching the Japanese carriers burn, expressed it simply. He said they had stood up to the absolute best the Japanese had and completely destroyed it. After witnessing that, they knew with certainty they would win the war. It was merely a question of time and how much blood would be required. Post-war analysis conducted by both American and Japanese naval historians revealed the precise sequence of those 11 minutes in absolutely devastating detail. The Japanese carriers had been caught in what naval warfare theorists call the vulnerable window, that critical moment when an aircraft carrier is most completely helpless. They had aircraft being actively serviced on deck, preventing any defensive maneuvers. Fuel lines were connected to numerous aircraft, making catastrophic fires inevitable after any hit. Ordnance sat exposed on deck and in hangars, multiplying the damage from any bomb strike. The attention of every crew member was focused elsewhere, preventing early detection of the diving American aircraft. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the intelligence officer whose code-breaking team had made the entire ambush possible, later observed that they won because they knew precisely when the Japanese would be vulnerable, and they were fortunate enough to catch them at exactly that moment. 5 minutes earlier or later, and the battle's outcome would have been completely different. Today, the wrecks of the Japanese carriers lie in deep waters near Midway, serving as war graves for thousands of men. Oceanographic explorer Robert Ballard's expeditions successfully located Yorktown at 16,650 feet depth and Kaga at 17,700 feet, their hulls serving as permanent testimonies to those 11 minutes. Recent expeditions conducted in 2023 have provided detailed surveys of these wrecks, now legally protected within the Papahanaumokuakea Kea Marine National Monument. Survivors from both nations established memorial sites on both sides of the Pacific. At commemoration ceremonies, former enemies have met as friends, united in recognition of a battle that fundamentally changed human history. The Japanese Navy's systematic attempt to hide Midway's outcome from its own civilian population, quarantining survivors, swearing them to absolute secrecy, claiming victory while concealing catastrophic defeat, corroded morale throughout the entire fleet and established a pattern of official deception that would continue until the war's conclusion. Military historians have endlessly debated alternative scenarios for how those 11 minutes might have unfolded differently. What if Tone's scout aircraft had launched on schedule? Though paradoxically, modern research demonstrates the delay actually helped the Japanese discover the Americans earlier than they otherwise would have. What if Nagumo had maintained a permanent reserve strike force? What if the American torpedo bombers hadn't sacrificed themselves? What if McCluskey hadn't followed that lone Japanese destroyer? But human history possesses no alternative timelines or parallel universes. What actually happened in those 11 minutes changed absolutely everything about the Pacific War and the world that followed. Modern military strategists and war college professors still intensively study Midway for lessons applicable to contemporary military conflicts. Information dominance remains absolutely decisive in warfare. First strike advantage in high-technology combat usually determines final outcomes. All military systems possess moments of maximum vulnerability that enemies can exploit. Individual decisions made under extreme pressure still determine historical outcomes, despite advanced technology. Superior systems and logistics defeat superior warriors and fighting spirit. In letters, personal diaries, and interviews collected over 8 decades, survivors painted intimate portraits of those 11 minutes. American and Japanese accounts converge on the absolute chaos, the extraordinary heroism, the paralyzing terror, and the fundamental transformation that occurred in those decisive moments. The United States Naval War College's official analysis concludes that Midway's 11 minutes remain the definitive gold standard for decisive military action in modern warfare. Never before or since has such a compressed window of time so completely and irreversibly reversed strategic reality. Economic historians have calculated that those 11 minutes cost Japan approximately 2 billion yen, measured in 1942 currency values, representing roughly 15% of Japan's entire annual military budget. But the indirect economic costs proved far greater than direct losses. Pilot training programs were accelerated, dramatically reducing quality. Resources were diverted from other critical projects to replace lost carriers. Industrial capacity was strained beyond sustainable limits. Technical development was rushed, leading to serious design flaws in subsequent aircraft. America, conversely, found its war economy completely vindicated by Midway's outcome. The carriers lost at Midway were replaced within months of their sinking. The industrial machine that had seemed impossible to Japanese military observers was merely beginning its wartime production. In Japanese culture, Midway became a powerful metaphor for nemesis, representing that inevitable moment when excessive confidence meets harsh reality. The term Midway syndrome actually entered Japanese business vocabulary, describing organizational overconfidence leading to catastrophic institutional failure. Japanese Admiral Tanaka Raizo, writing extensively after the war concluded, observed that those 11 minutes taught Japan that the age of the samurai warrior was permanently finished. Individual courage, martial skill, and spiritual dedication meant absolutely nothing when confronting systematic intelligence gathering, overwhelming industrial production, and technological superiority. They entered those 11 minutes as proud warriors. They emerged as historical anachronisms. Survivors from both nations carried unique psychological burdens for the remainder of their lives. American dive bomber pilots who had delivered death in those 11 minutes often suffered profound survivor's guilt. Japanese sailors who lived through the inferno faced cultural shame for surviving when their ships had died. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose single bomb had destroyed the Akagi, never flew combat missions again due to tuberculosis contracted from breathing caustic soda that leaked from his aircraft's oxygen system. He spent decades wondering about the hundreds of men he killed with that one perfectly placed bomb. He said in a 1995 interview that he did his duty as ordered, but performing one's duty doesn't ease the knowledge that his success meant death for hundreds of enemy sailors doing their own duty. Modern computer simulations have recreated those 11 minutes with extremely precise detail, revealing exactly how narrow the margin between victory and defeat actually was. If the American dive bombers had arrived merely 5 minutes later, Japanese combat air patrol would have been refueled and positioned at high altitude. If they had arrived 10 minutes earlier, Japanese flight decks wouldn't have been packed with fully armed and fueled aircraft. If cloud cover had been 500 feet lower in altitude, the dive bombers couldn't have executed their attacks effectively. If wind direction had been different, carriers couldn't have launched or recovered aircraft at that moment. The simulation's conclusion was stark. Those 11 minutes represented the only operational window in a 2-hour period when the Japanese carriers were catastrophically vulnerable to dive bomber attack. The Americans hit that precise window perfectly through a combination of skill, determination, and extraordinary luck. Military operational doctrine worldwide changed fundamentally based on lessons learned from those 11 minutes. Carriers began operating in dispersed formations rather than concentrated groups. Combat air patrol maintained multiple altitude layers continuously rather than concentrating at one level. Deckload strikes became standard procedure, minimizing hangar exposure time. Damage control became equally important as offensive strike capability. Intelligence gathering received equal priority with actual combat operations. The United States Navy completely rewrote its carrier warfare manual based exclusively on Midway's lessons. The Japanese Navy couldn't afford to implement the changes their own analysis recommended. They lacked sufficient resources to maintain constant air patrol coverage or rapid rearmament capability under combat conditions. Ultimately, those 11 minutes came down to individual human decisions made under absolutely extreme pressure by ordinary men. McCluskey's decision to follow that lone destroyer rather than returning to base. Best's split-second choice of which specific target to attack. Nagumo's fateful order to rearm for land attack. Spruance's calculated risk to launch at maximum range. Individual pilots pressing attacks despite facing certain death. Admiral Spruance later reflected extensively on the battle's outcome. He observed that they won because American mistakes proved recoverable while Japanese mistakes were not. In those 11 minutes, every Japanese error was catastrophically magnified, while every American gamble paid off handsomely. It wasn't divine justice or manifest destiny. It was probability and statistics finally catching up with accumulated risk. At the 75th anniversary commemoration of Midway in 2017, the last surviving participants from both nations spoke at memorial ceremonies. Their words captured the enormous weight of those 11 minutes that had defined the remainder of the 20th century and shaped the world we inhabit today. Human history remembers those 11 minutes as simultaneously glorious achievement and necessary horror. They defined not merely a single naval battle, but an entire historical era, proving conclusively that in modern industrialized warfare, strategic advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly. They demonstrated beyond doubt that intelligence capabilities, technological advancement, and industrial capacity matter far more than military tradition, individual training, and tactical superiority. They showed that individual decisions made at crucial moments can outweigh years of careful preparation and planning. Between 20 minutes past 10 and 31 minutes past 10 on June 4, 1942, the entire trajectory of human history shifted fundamentally. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, representing the pride of the Imperial Navy, the primary instruments of Pacific conquest, the ultimate symbols of Japanese military power, were transformed into burning wrecks sinking toward the ocean floor. The American aircraft that had launched in desperate, completely uncoordinated attacks had somehow achieved what had seemed utterly impossible just hours before: decisive victory against a numerically and qualitatively superior enemy force. Those 11 minutes proved conclusively that in modern warfare, advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly based on information, timing, and execution. They demonstrated that intelligence gathering, technological capability, and industrial capacity matter far more than military tradition, extensive training, and tactical superiority. They showed that individual decisions made at crucial historical moments can outweigh years of preparation. The Japanese pilots who had ruled Pacific skies for 6 months discovered in 11 minutes that their perceived dominance was merely an illusion built on temporary technological and tactical advantage. The American pilots who had been dismissed as inferior discovered they could utterly destroy the world's most experienced naval aviation force when circumstances and timing aligned properly. In those 11 minutes, thousands of Japanese sailors died, leaving behind widows who would never learn how their husbands actually died, children who would grow up without fathers, and a nation forced to confront the painful difference between comforting mythology and harsh reality. Today, the Pacific Ocean flows peacefully over the graves of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Yorktown rests nearby in the darkness, American and Japanese wrecks sharing the same cold, deep waters. They remain there as permanent monuments to those 11 minutes when the future was forged in falling bombs and rising flames, when young men died for causes they genuinely believed in, and when the modern world was born in violence that seemed endless, but actually lasted less time than an ordinary coffee break. Those 11 minutes stand as human history's most compressed lesson in the absolute futility of military arrogance, the overwhelming power of intelligence and innovation, and the terrible cost of strategic miscalculation. They remind us that in warfare as in life, everything can change in moments, that perceived superiority is always temporary, and that the price of error is invariably paid in human blood and suffering. The final word belongs to Admiral Nagumo, who survived those 11 minutes physically but never recovered from them psychologically. Before his death on Saipan in 1944, he wrote that at Midway they learned wars are not won by individual warriors, but by systematic organization. In 11 minutes, the American system completely destroyed their warrior tradition. They thought they were fighting the previous war more effectively. The Americans were fighting the next war first. Those 11 minutes were not a battle. They were an execution of obsolescence by innovation, and the world has never been the same.